In Essential Task 4.7, we are going to introduce one of the biggest key psychologists in this course, none other than Sigmund Freud. He is the individual pictured over my shoulder smoking a cigar. He's actually pictured throughout the classroom quite a few times. Freud's going to offer a very unique perspective on personality, and then the subsequent personality tests that were developed in order to evaluate his theories are also in and of themselves rather unique and contrast personality inventories quite a bit. For this concept map, I think you could hold the piece of paper either horizontal or vertical, sort of depending on the size of your handwriting. I would personally do this vertically, but I want to give you a sense of what this looks like. At the top, we're going to talk about Freud's psychoanalytic perspective. That involves the two boxes here and then the two across here. So these four boxes. Then at the bottom, this continues onward into talking about the actual type of personality test that exists to study Freud's work, which are the three boxes you see here at the bottom. I would personally do this vertically. I will say, although I know it's not visualized like this, if you really like horizontal, where it breaks off here into studying the unconscious, if you take these three boxes and place them to the right in this region here, but here where the pink Freud picture is located, you probably could fit the concept map horizontally. So if you take these three boxes and move them here, that would also work. I have it positioned like this. I would personally do this vertically, but as I just alluded to, you could make a very reasonable alteration to the way it's pictured on the Prezi, and then use that for your concept map. I'll give you a moment, though, to pause the video here, copy down the portion in yellow. We're going to start, as we typically do, all the way at the top, and talk about the psychoanalytic perspective. You could see the term psychoanalysis, or psychoanalytically oriented, or even the word psychodynamic, and it's all essentially referencing the same concept. The concept that we're talking about today are the ones that are offered by Sigmund Freud, who gets a key psychologist icon. As I alluded to, he is one of the most important names in this course, simply due to the fact that he's probably one of the most well-known psychologists, even by people who haven't taken a psychology course. Freud is going to offer a very different perspective on personality from trait theorists. Freud believed that personality was a reflection of unconscious motives and unconscious conflicts. And what he defined as unconscious, we need to talk about in just a little bit. But to give you a preview of that, whatever comprised your conscious level are things that you're aware of, your current thoughts, your current feelings, the behavior that you're exhibiting, what other people see when they watch you. The thing that actually mattered, according to Freud, though, was what occurred on an unconscious level. I often like to visualize Freud's theory like an iceberg, where the conscious level is the tip of the iceberg, but the majority of the iceberg is what's underwater, what would be the equivalent of the unconscious level. The unconscious level are things that you're not consciously aware of, things like irrational urges, things like traumatic childhood memories, things like your sexual drives, things like your moral compass, things that you're not consciously aware of at any given moment, but could be deeply affecting your personality. And in the eyes of Freud, very much affected your personality. When Freud discussed this notion of unconscious motives and conflicts, he developed three different structures, what I'm going to call the structure of the mind. And these three contrasting structures exist at all times, and the relationship between these three unique structures ultimately affects your behavior and your personality. Again, I like to visualize this with an iceberg. So we're going to start at the top talking about a concept called the ego. The ego is very much the concept of the three that is above the iceberg. That's why you see this iceberg visual. And then we're going to transition down and talking about the id and the superego, the two that are below the iceberg and the way this is set up. First, we'll start with the ego. Again, I like to visualize this with an iceberg, so this is above the surface. The ego is what other people see in your personality, but it's specifically the conscious mediator of the demands between the superego and the id. As we'll see in just a few moments, the superego and id are two unconscious structures that have two incredibly contrasting, totally polarized demands. And if you were to listen to one over the other, your personality would be incredibly polarized. Again, we'll see what that looks like when we talk about those two structures. As we'll see, you can't really listen exclusively to the id or superego. That would be impractical, partially because the ego has to deal with reality, meaning the laws and the social norms of society. So in many ways, what the ego does is it tries to balance out these unique unconscious conflicts while dealing with the fact that the real world doesn't really match up with what the superego or the id would actually like to do under all circumstances. Again, we'll transition now, zoom back out, and now we're going to talk about the two below the surface unconscious structures. We're going to start with the id on the left, and then we'll contrast that to the superego. The id is your unconscious, animalistic, and oftentimes very unacceptable desires. The id is what whispers in your ear when somebody cuts you off to run them off the road. Now, obviously, in society, that you certainly wouldn't choose to run over a pedestrian or run over somebody or drive your car into somebody. That's obviously unacceptable. But that little whisper in the back of your mind that's telling you to do that would be what the id would represent. That unconscious, many times unacceptable whispers and desires that are, again, on an unconscious level. And again, you certainly can't listen to it all the time. That's what the ego is here for, to temper down the impulses and urges of the id. One of the other qualities of the id, one of the other drives and motivations are any sexual desires, which we're going to call libido. Freud actually wrote exhaustively about sexual desires. Freud gets a little weird, so bear with me here for a little bit. Freud believed that you have sexual desires the entirety of your life, starting literally from the moment you were born, which I know sounds odd, but an infant, 5 months old, has sexual desires in their own unique way. And that as you progressively age from infant into child and into adolescence, teenage years, and so on and so forth, the manner in which you satisfy those sexual desires changes. You actually go through, at least according to Freud, 5 unique psychosexual stages, where the id is always whispering in your ear to please these sexual energies. Just the manner in which you do so changes quite dramatically. It's not likely the AP exam would get into any great depth on those psychosexual stages. They might just broadly reference them. I would like you to watch, though, about a minute and 15 seconds worth of a crash course that talks about the psychosexual stages, just so that you can sort of hear the stages and see the way in which it works. But we're not going to emphasize them much more than that. Though I will recommend watching that. You'll learn about the Oedipus complex, which is really quite unique. The other thing beyond sexual desires are the aggressive desires. I kind of alluded to this a moment ago when somebody drives you off the side of the road or cuts you off and you really want to take out your aggression, but in the back of your mind, you also don't want to go to jail for motor vehicle homicide. That's your aggressive desires, id whispering in your ear. At the end of the day, the id is always telling you to seek pleasure over everything, what we call the pleasure principle. Don't worry about the consequences. Don't worry about the punishments. If you want to knock that person out and take their wallet so you can go spend their money and enjoy something right now, do it. Again, obviously, societal norms, laws, etc. would inhibit you from doing that. Your ego is going to sort of push back on that. But that's what your id is always doing. Telling you to go into directions that are often unacceptable, definitely on an unconscious level, oftentimes very aggressive and sometimes sexual. The other end of the spectrum is what we call the superego. The superego is just the total opposite. We're talking about the perfect moral compass, but always striving for moral perfection, donating all of your time and all of your money, which is obviously a desirable thing to do, donate, work in charities, etc. But it's also equally as impractical. You can't devote every second of your life to some type of moral perfection. So although it's not as obviously impractical as the id, in reality, it's also equally as impractical because you can't actually do that. You have to care about yourself at least a little bit. You need to put a roof over your head. You need to put food on the table, etc. So you can't always be this perfect moral self. But at the end of the day, if you see a wallet on the side of the road, your superego is going to whisper in your ear, return that wallet. Your id is going to whisper in your ear, take all the money. And your ego sort of has to balance what you think the best thing to do is. And in that circumstance, you might listen to your superego, certainly more than you would your id. As a mnemonic, just to zoom out for a second to show you where I am, you can include these mnemonics within the boxes, or you can include it separate like I did. But when I look at these three next to each other, the letters ID, I think of idiot. You might not even actually see it in capitalized letters on the AP exam. It might just be ID lowercase. I like to do it capitalized because I like to really make it blunt. The id makes you act like an idiot. If you were to listen to your id all the time, you would be a total idiot. You'd get in a lot of trouble also. I'm going to switch all the way to the right and then go to the ego. The superego, on the other hand, makes you, at least in theory, act like the perfect superhero. Totally selfless, totally sacrificial, doing whatever it takes to make the society a better place. The ego, on the other hand, has to equalize. So I take the EQ and equalize, and I know Q and G are different letters, but they are similar in the shape. So when I look at ego, I think of the ego working as an equalizer between the id and idiot and the super and superhero, having to find a nice balancing between the two. In order to actually test any of this material, people had to come up with some rather unique personality tests. So these are going to be classified as personality tests, but they're very unique and they're nothing like personality inventories. These were created in many ways in the aftermath of Freud's work by individuals who bought into Freud's theories and wanted to carry those out in psychiatric fields. First concept that we have to talk about is the name of the test that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about what are called projective tests. Projective tests are subjective tests used by psychoanalysts or people who are psychoanalytically oriented as a means of accessing the unconscious. Because again, the id and the superego exist on an unconscious level. You don't consciously know that they're there. And your impulses, your traumatic childhood experiences, all of those things exist again on an unconscious level, which by definition are things you're unaware of. Well, individuals that bought into psychoanalysis had to come up with a type of test, at least in their opinion, to access what was in your unconscious. So they came up with these tests that are called projective style tests. Some examples. Tell a story. I'm going to analyze your story. Or I'm going to begin a sentence and I'd like you to finish it. Or take a look at this picture. What do you see? Those types of tests give the test taker the opportunity to express how they feel, express what they're thinking, express the first thing that comes to mind. And then the psychoanalyst, the person responsible for administering the test, actually has to sit there and determine from their perspective what that means about the person's personality, which makes this subjective. Unlike what we talked about the other day with objective personality inventories, this is absolutely not read by a computer. This is directly attributed to the interpretation of the test administrator, which means you could actually get two totally different interpretations about your personality and about what's happening on an unconscious level, depending on which test administrator you work with, which again makes this subjective. There's a considerable amount of potential bias here, depending on who it is that's administering your test and what it is that they view as standing out from your story or from what you see. That makes this not terribly reliable. Again, you get totally different scores just depending on who administered the test. And research shows this is not particularly valid. It's still practiced in some circles, but it in and of itself really doesn't check off the criteria of a well-designed test. It's not reliable and it's not particularly valid. As a mnemonic, as you're going to see, what we are about to talk about are pretty visual. So I always like to think of the fact that school projects themselves tend to be very visual. You make school projects for a bunch of different school subjects. So I connect the word subject and project so that when I look at the word projective, I always remember these are the subjective tests, which means it's not read by a computer. There's potential for bias. My score is all dependent on who administered the test to me. So there are two. The concept here is we're going to present you some type of vague stimuli, something that's sort of open-ended. There's no right or wrong answer. We're going to present this to you, and now we're going to interpret your response. The first is the famous Rorschach ink block test, just like the picture that you see here at the bottom. This is by far the most common projective style test, but it's very simple. You present the test taker with some type of ink block picture, and you ask them, what do you see? And if you look at that and see, two bears giving each other high fives or whatever it is that you see, your response would then be interpreted by the test administrator, and then that person would respond back with something about your personality. If you see two bears giving a high five, then that means you're seeking more cooperation in your life. That's a reflection of your personality. Or maybe you see something totally different. Maybe you see a face with two horns. It almost looks like sort of the devil's face. Well, if that's what you were to see, then the person who's administering the test might respond back, oh, well, maybe that means you have an overreactive id that's trying to push you towards making irrational, aggressive decisions. And maybe you want to take it out on your boss who just fired you or something like that. So the personality that you would get back, the response that you would get back would be totally dependent on the test administrator's interpretation of your response. And again, you could go down the street to a different psychoanalyst and get a totally different interpretation. Not reliable, also hasn't been shown to be valid. Just to reiterate here, I made a comment a moment ago that projective tests kind of look like school projects. Again, it's very visual, very artistic. So again, it kind of looks like a school project. The other one that's really common is the thematic apperception test. The thematic apperception test is a little bit more involved. It has a little bit more to it, but it involves looking at, again, some type of vague stimuli, a picture like the one that you see here, and then asking the test taker what happened before, during, and after this photograph. And then the person taking the test would sit there and say, well, perhaps before this child was practicing his violin. Right now, he's upset because he has an upcoming competition that he hasn't practiced for. And then after this picture occurs, he fails that test. That might be my before, during, and after. And then again, the test administrator would sit there taking notes, thinking about what that means, and then tell me, your personality is unfulfilled because all you think about is failure. Well, sure, that would be my personality according to this test administrator. So the thematic apperception test, again, it's another projective style test. Sort of looks like a school project because it's visual, right? And then as an additional mnemonic, a lot of people make really dramatic stories when using the thematic apperception test. The word dramatic rhymes with thematic, and I connect those two as a rhyming mnemonic. But again, at the end of the day, the concept here is we're going to administer tests. These aren't multiple choice. This isn't true or false. These are extremely open-ended, and it requires a test administrator to interpret all of your results, which make these not particularly reliable, and they haven't been shown to really hold any validity either. But again, at the end of the day, these are designed to study Freud's work, who, by definition, is trying to access your unconscious, which again is things that you're unaware of, which requires these more unique, unusual types of personality tests in order to potentially even work in the first place.